So here we are again, part 20 of Parmenides, the Platonic dialogue. And I want to begin by saying that maybe with a general reflection on how this has been since we're 40 hours, about to be 40 hours into this series. You know, there are days that I feel as though I have done a lot to further myself and to be closer with God and to do good things. There are other times where I feel as though I have made quite poor decisions, and it has done the exact opposite. It has moved me away from God. It has moved me away from that center point of attention for which the capacity to do good things is afforded me. And this series has been a lot of up and down, and it's been a lot of exercising to places that have been tedious and perhaps mundane. But nonetheless, it has been worthwhile. There have been sweet moments that I could not recreate except through the Parmenidean experience. And so it's my desire now, approaching this new 2-hour segment, that while this 2 hours is not going to be recorded all in the same day, I wish that this experience is one that is filled with attention, that is one of continuing opportunity, and something that is more continuous with my prayers rather than something that I pray beforehand and then go into this thing for my own selfish posturing. While we find ourselves in narrow fields, narrow bounds, the approach is logical and it's strict. I try to move out and to experiment and to move myself closer to that divine sensibility. And so it's within this hope and this the sacred disposition that I wish to maintain that attentive spirit. Okay, so with that, let's get into this dialogue. So in the past, I have approached this a few different ways. Sometimes I've just read sentence by sentence. Sometimes I've read paragraph by paragraph, read the paragraph, go back and interpret. Sometimes it's page by page. Sometimes it's 2 pages. But for now, I think I'm going to be doing this paragraph by paragraph. So let's begin. Parmenides says, "Don't you in fact call getting a share of being coming to be?" "I do." "And parting from being ceasing to be?" "Most certainly," says Aristotle. "Indeed, the one, as it seems, when it gets and releases being, comes to be and ceases to be." "Necessarily." "And since it is one and many, and comes to be and ceases to be, doesn't its being many cease to be whenever it comes to be one? And doesn't its being one cease to be whenever it comes to be many?" "Certainly." Whenever it comes to be one and many, must it not separate and combine? It certainly must. Furthermore, whenever it comes to be like and unlike, must it not be made like and unlike? Yes. And whenever it comes to be greater and less and equal, must it not increase and decrease and be made equal? Just so. So here I think it's worth mentioning that we're moving into a territory that is quite familiar, in the sense that since we have come off of the dialogue of the sophist, this language is much more approaching the problems that were mentioned in that dialogue, because we're getting into being and non-being. One of my, I wouldn't say it's a complaint, but it's a general observation. The sophist, I appreciate the dialogues for what they are, and I don't wish to be critical or overly critical, unduly critical. But there is an observation by which, understanding the limitations, a dialogue may not address the fullness of Parmenides' argument. And perhaps they're not addressing the argument in this specific dialogue per se. This is general thoughts as they were a few thousand years ago. Who knows how that came through to the interlocutors and the sophist. But there's been a lot of discussion so far that is not just on what we are about to get into here. And so I'd like to try and open that to expose this argument not only to the sophist's reflection and solution, but also to bring in some of the subtlety of the tributaries that we have explored and experienced along the way in this particular dialogue that the sophist does not address. So let's begin with some general reflections here. So he says, don't you in fact call getting a share of being coming to be? Now, this is a pretty basic statement, but I want to describe it in the landscape that we've been producing for this sort of thing, and the grammar that we've been using. So, getting a share of being, it's kind of an interesting statement. When I think of this, my mind goes into this image. It's a landscape, like I'm being thrust into this place with all of this information, sort of an abundance of information. I'm trying to find this signal through the noise of the information. But the information is not just sort of white static chaos. They are identities. Many of them are firmly integrated. I can identify them. And they're all sort of relating with each other. And what I'm observing is this big cosmic interplay of identities, exchanging information, interacting with each other, interacting with the fundamental fields that I've been calling it, these sort of principled fields, philosophical fields, not necessarily in the sense of physics, but I've been considering these fields and maybe in other words these principles as pillars that are foundational. They aren't moved readily. If they are, it's uncertain how I would even describe it or be aware of it, but perhaps at some point in thinking about things I discover the way it's possible. But as of right now, our fundamentals remain quite stable because they support or facilitate the expression of identity. Being, of course, is one of them. Oneness is another. Time is one of those things also that has that quality by which it affords the interplay of this information. So we can have something that was before, now, and after. We have this measurable change. And this coming to be implies time, implies the influence of it, that it exists within a landscape that can be measured in a particular way. The measurement that we use we ultimately call it time. But when something is coming to be, using the language getting a share of coming to be, I think about a share of a pie or something, that there's a piece of a whole that we're getting. And this is it's a basic heuristic. It is what it is. But I think it's a springboard into something that's a little bit more interesting, maybe. Maybe that's not a sophisticated word to use, but a little bit more subtle. In the sense that the share, as we spoke of before about the significance of time in the proportional domain, can be quite variable. The way in which information is exchanged is, as I've said, subtle, perhaps dramatic, but in fact, the variability of it allows us to see many possibilities. And I think that it's easy to get lost in all of these possibilities. Here is where the noise sort of comes in, and finding the signal through all of that possibility to have productive thought can be quite, for myself at least, can be quite challenging. But we have Parmenides that is saying, coming to be implies getting a share. And so I have to ask myself, within all of the noise, within the difference of non-being, how can we come up with a conception of this share of being? What we're speaking of is a birth of something, a birth of an identity, information that is traveling, that there is this boundary by which the identity is characterized, but also the internal mechanics form something fundamental to the thing in question. It gives what I might use to describe the word essence. I Google the word essence. The intrinsic nature or indispensable quality of something, especially something abstract that determines its character. We ask ourselves, we spend a lot of time trying to explore those things that produce character, that produce qualities. And while that thing seems to be easy and straightforward because we had experienced it all of the time, it's really not. It's anything but simple. So I'm going to utilize Google's AI here to assist with our defining. In defining identity, the attributes that give a thing its identity, distinguishing it from all other things. Now there must be an interrelationship here. In the sense that we could take one thing from an identity and we say, is this the essence of it? And I would have to imagine that any single part or any component, which I guess would also be a part, would not be the thing that determines its essence. Its essence would be determined by a series of relationships a particular structure of those relationships. The interesting thing is earlier today I was going through a thought experiment about neurotransmitters. For some reason I can't really remember what the reason for my curiosity was, but I was exploring dopamine and the effects, the role that neurotransmitter plays in the brain. And this is something that subtly you study it in college and graduate school, but without the underlying significance to drive the mind to want to ask interesting questions about it, it just sort of falls by the wayside in time. But what came up was an interesting image of the way in which the brain utilizes neurotransmitters themselves. These molecules that are keys that open these various doors. When the doors are open, then you have this pathway, this sort of cascading pathway that can lead to to many things. It can lead to desire. It can lead to the initiation of movement. It can lead to the cessation of movement. It could lead to cognitive functioning, attention. All of these interesting aspects of our experience sort of defined mechanically in this way. And moreover from that, it's not just that there is one key or one door, nor is there one agent that uses a single key. There are many of these neural bundles within the brain, these different brain regions that may be responsible for requesting the release of a particular set of neurotransmitters that have an effect on some other part of the brain. Or there may be some sort of effect in the periphery, like an increased heart rate or dilation of blood vessels, or the opposite, the readiness of muscular contraction. All of these interrelated factors are occurring. And even this definition, or this explanation, doesn't necessarily describe me. It describes a process by which we can see how an I, in the sense of man, can emerge. But again, it's not one particular part that makes up this essence. It's the relationship of things that make up the essence. And so getting this share of being, in one sense, we're talking about the fundamental slice that the expression of the one offers us. It offers us an opportunity to participate in being and oneness. It's not a finite slice, per se. It's just the opportunity. And when that opportunity emerges, regardless of how it emerges, I think we find ourselves in a place of seeing coming to be in slightly a different way. Do you in fact call getting a share of being coming to be? I do, says Aristotle. And parting from being, ceasing to be. Most certainly. Now, in the case of ceasing to be, I don't think we have to do any particular dramatic reflection on that. We've sufficiently covered it in coming to be. It's just the opposite that occurs in the experience of exiting, or in death, or transformation, whatever it is. And I want to keep on the top of mind here the importance of transformation in the layered context. That is, if something is coming to an end, it doesn't mean that the end is all encompassing. Just like if we speak about nothing or absence, it doesn't mean that because in the relationship among things, it allows something that is not to be, or something that is sort of absent, maybe in a material sense, or again, in a relational sense. It doesn't mean that this is the nature of reality. It just means that our reality, defined by the expression of oneness and being, has allowed it to be the case that even absence is intelligible, identifiable. And in more subtle and graduated manners, we can speak of a human being that undergoes some transformative process by which, when they transform, they don't die physically. Maybe there's an element of them that dies psychologically, or mentally, spiritually, and they are reborn, hopefully, into something that is better, good. Indeed, the one, says Parmenides, as it seems, when it gets and releases being, comes to be and ceases to be. What a beautiful place to be, because we haven't discussed this sort of thing. The first thing that comes to mind here is the word, when the one releases being. A beautiful statement, I think. Plenty of different ways I think one can go about expressing this experience, but releasing its being is kind of interesting. I think there are issues with it, right? But we ought not to think about things too negatively. We should take what we have and build upon it. Let the seed grow, regardless of what seed it is. And we can make adjustments as we need to. So it releases this being. And so again, what returns to mind is this expanse of information and of coherent identities that are less coherent, more chaotic, that are moving to and fro, moving into oneness and out of oneness very rapidly. Their neighbors, much like them, unstable, always changing. Other states, places of stability and of harmony. When it gets and releases being, comes to be and ceases to be. So this is a layer separation between the ground, which is the one. I've been calling the ground the field as well. But the ground and what we might call the one of the articulated order, or the one as is articulated in discourse. And this is somewhat consistent with where we are going, in the sense that when we speak about the one and we give the one some predication, some attribution of a quality or some sort of state, identity, position to the one, it becomes marred within the relational language. And of course we've experienced this so much already with saying that the one is younger and older than itself. It's younger than older and older than other things. It's by its nature, I think it's so pervasive. It is such a foundational concept and identity that it's difficult not to see it in every fiber of this relational network or relational web. So now I think that where we are is one of the most beautiful points in this dialogue. And I say that because we are at the point at which we are at the transition point between the one as ground and then the one as articulated with this predication language. Indeed, the one, again says Parmenides, as it seems, when it gets and releases being, comes to be and ceases to be. So I say that we are in the in-between because on one hand, if we stay at the ground and we are to apply the same language that Parmenides uses here, that when it gets and releases being, there's really no receiving or releasing being in that sense from the grounded sense. Now, why do I say that? Because the one as ground is a precondition. It is not something that is a holder of all the information that is, or picks and chooses where being ought to be spread. The one as an identity is primarily that engine of affordance. And by that, preference is not really, at least not yet. Preference is not within the toolkit of the one. Now we can say that there's a degree of preference because it's made up of certain components, and by the ground that is produced by this thing, we have the reality that we have. So there can be some things said about directedness, and also in the case of the predicated, articulated order, there is much direction, there is much purpose in all of this. Not entirely a separate conversation, but it's getting a little too far from where we are in the dialogue. Rather, I think when we stick to the one and we think about this giving and receiving being at the level of ground, we're applying it at the wrong level, at the wrong layer. It would be more appropriate to apply it to the immediate layer just above. When we have our sort of primordial determinate landscape that emerges, when we have the emergence of qualities and the emergence of properties, when we see the vast interplay of temporal relations, here it's easier to see. But then, at these levels, we have to ask the question, well, how are we going to draw this relationship back to the one? And it's difficult, again, because the one now is within the predicated grammar. And so, in order to avoid statements like saying all is one, which in a sense we can make that statement, it would be, and perhaps in another sense it would be imprecise to do so. We have to be careful about how we choose to find and give the predicate of releasing or getting being. Because this sort of action is, as mentioned, that predicated grammar, and it is also outside of the immediate affordance landscape of the one. as ground. So that means we have to establish new language, I think, to think about the one as it is now participating within difference, time, and generally articulation. So at the base level, we know that the one, as it becomes differentiated, or rather I should say, as the expression of the one becomes more angular and differentiated, what separates one identity from another are the various states, identity states, and that could be individual identities that make up the whole of another identity, let's say. And this gets back to the word essence, the sort of fundamental nature of something. And much like speaking about these parts of the thing as these broad networks by which it's easier to conceptualize, I think as a general map of understanding the identity landscape, there are important principles by which we would outline or measure, perhaps, an identity. That is ontological shape, relational constitution. Now, relational constitution and ontological shape, I think, are sort of overlapping terms. In the sense that they are different, I have to imagine that when I say an ontological orientation, or an ontological shape, let's say, I'm relating it in a comparative manner to something. What that something is, I'm inclined to say the divine logos, the divine orienting pillar towards what is good. A concept that we haven't really talked about. We've been fairly bland in our religious language. And then, in terms of relational dynamics, what we have is perhaps the interrelationships between different identity states. And all of these have shapes that are associated with them. So when it comes to getting and releasing being, if the one, in the articulated sense, as sort of a subset, or the pre-ground, let's say, of an identity. So if I take my cat, for example, as the primary identity, the pre-ground is the expression of the one as it is expressed within the form of the cat. And so the cat has many different qualities, many different properties, and there are ways in which we would measure what that thing is. And as far as it gets its being, what it is getting is a form or an orientation of oneness and being. And when the one in the form of the cat is releasing being, we could say that the action of the cat perhaps is causing the shape of another identity to change. Maybe when the cat eats, it is breaking down an identity state of a piece of chicken, for example, or altering the identity state of the character and the general disposition of the home environment that I've created and have decided to include this animal in. So in many different ways I think that we can think about that. But this is much different, I think, than thinking about it in terms of a sort of a getting and releasing of the one as ground. So again, Parmenides says, "Indeed, the one, as it seems, when it gets and releases being, comes to be and ceases to be." There's a way in which the cat is always coming to be, and there's a manner of constancy that is associated with it. That's why it's an identity in the first place. There's a degree of stability. Time is progressing, but the cat is still laying on his back in front of the microphone. But there's a sense in which being is continually being added, let's say, in the sense that the identity is being maintained. In the biological example, it's much easier to see this, so it's good to have the cat as an example, because every cell is going through its life process, and every cell will not have the same lifespan as the whole, as the cat. And so there's an interesting interplay of cellular interactions that maintain the stability of the animal over time. Of course, the animal eventually will perish, just as I will. But nonetheless, I think this is one potential way that we can see the one, in the form of the cat, getting being. And releasing being we've already discussed. Parmenides continues and he says, "And since it is one and many, and comes to be and ceases to be, doesn't its being many cease to be whenever it comes to be one? And doesn't its being one cease whenever it comes to be many?" So there's a few different levels by which I'm considering this. In the first, I think about that transition from ground to the more articulated expression of the one into what we would call specific or individuated identities. For in this experience, what has changed is the view, the observation. When something ceases to be one, what we're talking about is a process of transformation. We're not saying that oneness is gone. We are saying that it becomes something that it was not before. And so, while oneness is continuous throughout, the changing dynamics and the underlying fundamentals of anything in question that is to undergo that change will have found itself so unrecognizable that new identity states emerge. They are characterized. And so I can take any example. I'll take the example of the what I'm looking at here. I have a polished stone sculpture of a skull, and that thing is composed of many different parts, many different colors of rock that are exposed through its polished surface. And there are reasons why the color is expressed in that particular way. There are reasons why the material is as compact as it is and as heavy as it is. There are reasons why it is the shape that it is in. And yet I could find myself in a situation in which perhaps I put it under a hydraulic press that destroys the form of the skull and perhaps ruins the polished surface and creates a fine powder, certainly moving from one to many. This powder itself has many parts to it. There are individual grains. These individual grains themselves have some sort of internal makeup to them. They participate in the broader whole in some way, by the way that they rest, by the way that they translate, by the way that they impact other objects, and so forth. But through that process of putting that thing through the hydraulic press, we have undergone the process of transformation from one state to another. And as mentioned before, the state is an important thing to reflect on because it's the fundamental place that we are pointing to a particular temporal distinction, and we are saying that the constitution of something is this way here at this time. Now, in the case of the one, it's another interesting reflection because it's not the exact same type of transformation that occurs in material things, like in the case of the skull. In the case of the one is not destroyed, necessarily. The expression of the one is changed, such that the qualities that surround this thing are descript. They are determinate. And because of the nature of the ground, we have the possibility for the expression of so many different things. So again he says, and since it is one and many and comes to be and ceases to be, doesn't its being many cease to be whenever it comes to be one? And doesn't its being one cease to be whenever it comes to be many? I want to keep in mind that when we consider one from the agentic perspective or from the subject's perspective, what I'm looking at is a particular layer, a layer that's available, it's afforded to my attention. For I can take anything and I can consider the oneness of that thing. I can consider the multiplicity of something, the variable elements in it, and by those various elements I can move my mind away from that unity of thing that it is. And it's not just the one thing that we dive into. We could say that it is one thing and then zoom out farther from that and say, well, it's participating in another broader whole, just like my home is a home because of the components within it. And so this this scale is a scale in some sense by which we attribute relevance. And I think that it's not dependent on the subject's view, because of course oneness and multiplicity is independent of my view of things. Regardless of whether or not something having some sort of subjective, self-aware, contemplative experience, there is this structure that unfolds and plays out. Motion is one of these fundamental things about our experience. In fact, our beliefs about the universe is that things are always in motion unless there's something that acts on it. And even if there is something that acts on it, if we dive into something, we find motion there, even if there is a relative stasis from one object compared to another. And in a like manner, I think the many also reflect this type of experience in the sense that we can see the many on different levels. Parmenides says, whenever it comes to be one and many, must it not separate and combine? Whenever it comes to be like and unlike, must it not be made like and unlike? So I think if there's anything that can be said about what Parmenides says here, it's that these two instances are mechanical reflections. That is, they are reflections on the mechanical operations that occur when we reflect on the process or experience of transformation from one state to another. We have separation, combination. We have like and unlike. Two are related, of course, but within likeness, what we don't have in terms of combination is that many things can come together that are not like, and yet they come together to form some coherent whole. Like, on the other hand, things come together to participate in a manner that is reflective of a similar state of coherence. Now, within oneness and within combination, of course, we have likeness within it. We have maybe a shared purpose. We have compatibility in a particular way. And I think that, however that might manifest, directional, compositional, there is a sense of likeness. In the pure sense of likeness, what we have is not the same as is in the sense of looking in the mirror, that we are experiencing the exact thing. But what we are experiencing is perhaps maybe a copy or a state of representing the one as having a generally similar state, relationally, positionally, compositionally, whatever. And whenever it comes to be greater and less and equal, must it not increase and decrease and be made equal? Now, this reminds me of our conversations about the determinate landscape, in which the primordial identities are formed by these types of terms. Likeness, unlike, greater, lesser, separate, combined, inside, outside, center, periphery. So moving into the next paragraph, Parmenides says, and whenever being in motion, it comes to a rest, and whenever being at rest, it changes to moving. It must itself presumably be in no time at all. How is that? Says Aristotle. It won't be able to undergo being previously at rest. and later in motion, or being previously in motion and later at rest without changing? Obviously not. Yet there is no time in which something can, simultaneously, be neither in motion nor at rest. Yes, you're quite right. Yet surely it also doesn't change without changing. Hardly. So when does it change? For it does not change while it is at rest or in motion, or while it is in time. Yes, you're quite right. Now this conception is going to take some time to consider because it may conflict with my definition of time, which includes change, or at least the capacity to change, affords the opportunity for something to change. Now let's start with the first sentence here. And whenever being in motion, it comes to a rest. And whenever being at rest, it changes to moving, it must itself, presumably, be in no time at all. So let's reflect on what's happening here. We have some identity that was in motion and has come to a place of stasis, and then it returns again to motion. Parmenides says that there is no time occurring here at all. And in the immediate sense, I'm not sure why that would be the case. For in my original formulation, it was necessary for an identity state to undergo some process by which it is influenced or changed in some way, and this necessity was afforded by that grounding principle of time, such that there is a forward, there is a backward, there is a now, and there is an experience at each one of these points. And because of the experience at each one of these points, regardless of how quickly or how dramatically it's changing, it's something that can be identified within that landscape. That's time. It can be measured. So if a being is in motion, motion being one of these things that has an intimate relationship with time, what we are seeing is an afforded state of transformation. But keeping in mind that Parmenides is saying these sort of requirement states that if something is in motion, then effectively it comes to rest. And whenever something is at rest, it changes to moving. What's happening is this, I want to say oscillation, but it's not quite, well, I suppose it's an oscillation, but it's an oscillation in the sense that there is no temporal state. Obviously, this is what Parmenides is referring to, but the temporal state is one of, like a type of constancy, where if you have something with the definitive requirements of something is in motion, and then because it's in motion, then it returns to rest, and because it's at rest, it returns to motion. It's hard to see exactly what the experience of the identity is, other than, like I said, this sort of oscillating nothingness. And within this framework, we would have to ask the question, well, what does change look like here, given that there's no possibility for it to enter in? In any meaningful way, because of course it changes We have the rest, we have motion, but not for any type of time that matters, let's say. It won't be able to undergo being previously at rest and later in motion, or previously in motion and later at rest without changing. Now, changing in this context means that there's absolutely no state at which one can identify where it is, because if it's at rest, well, it's actually in motion, but if it's actually in motion, it's at rest. If you can't identify its state, you can't necessarily identify its capacity to change. Now, I understand that we're using change in, I think, two different ways here. I think Parmenides is using change in the sense that effectively there is no temporal state. There is no, although there's an implied motion, it's really not happening in a way. And because it's not happening, there's no formal change. There's no information transfer. It's a stagnation of information, a paradox, a closed loop of this paradoxical information. It doesn't escape, it doesn't take in, it's just constantly oscillating between two things. I think part of the reason why I don't like oscillation is because it implies this sort of subtle movement, but it's it's really just this meaningless identity state between the two that doesn't really classify much of anything. Yet there is no time in which something can simultaneously be neither in motion nor at rest. So at this point, I think it's becoming a little bit more clear exactly what Parmenides is doing. It seems like he's trying to unfold another conversation about time. And he's giving us a hypothetical. And by that hypothetical, we are forced to reconcile between certain things. What does it mean if there are no phases? There are no intervals, let's say, in a particular state. That is just a rapid oscillation between one and the other. There is no time in which something simultaneously be neither in motion nor at rest. So the implication to our definition of time, then, is that in order for time to be, there must be room for informational states to navigate. Now, what I want to separate out is organizational structure of identity, and then position on one hand, I want to say temporal state, but that we can't use that term here. Well, maybe we can. Temporal state just as a placeholder, and by that I mean the frame by which it is undergoing the transfer or the stasis of information, either the incoming, outgoing, or uninterrupted internal processing of information. Yet surely, he says, it also doesn't change without changing. So when does it change? For it does not change while it is at rest or in motion or while it is in time. He continues in the next paragraph and he says, "Is there then this queer thing in which it might be just when it changes?" What queer thing? The instant. The instant seems to signify something such that changing occurs from it to each of two states. For a thing doesn't change from rest while rest continues, for from motion while motion continues. Rather, this queer creature, the instant, lurks between motion and rest, being in no time at all. And to it, and from it, the moving thing changes to resting, and the resting thing changes to moving. It looks that way, says Aristotle. And the one, if in fact it both rests and moves, could change to each state. For only in this way could it do both, but in changing, it changes at an instant, and when it changes, it would be in no time at all, and just then it would be neither in motion nor at rest. No, it wouldn't. So beginning with the first sentence, is there this queer thing in which it might be just when it changes? So this has been a difficult thought experiment. The utility, again, seems to come and go. I think there are some practical aspects of it and some not. So I'm thinking about this state change between the motion and rest and motion. We're given a bit of an extreme example for which once something is at rest, then it's in motion, and once something is in motion, it's at rest. Just when it changes, we have something particular, something peculiar. The instant. So why would this be peculiar? Well, there's something to be said about time. When we observe things to change, we want to know the instant of the change, or that point in time by which we can identify that change happens. In fact, if we define the word instant or instance, so instant in the context of time, an instant refers to an immediate or very short point in time, a moment, a split second, or an infinitesimal duration. Immediate as an adjective meaning happening at once. Now we have instance as an example. A specific occurrence, example, or case of something. A concrete illustration of a general rule or concept. A particular stage or occasion of an event. Now, of course, the word that is used is instant. And the instant is like the tick of a clock. It is that moment in time. And it is a bit of a queer thing because This instant is in time, and as that last paragraph ended off, we had the rather confusing thought, well, is it the case that when this flip-flopping happens that it is outside of time? And I don't think so, because of how fundamental change is to time. That instant, says Parmenides, seems to signify something such that changing occurs from it to each of the two states. For a thing doesn't change from rest while rest continues, or from motion while motion continues. Now the state changes, as we have said all along, are the most fundamental components of how we are, how we're considering time, how this is something that is foundational and irreplaceable in its definite sense. While it is something that does not necessarily change itself, it is and does offer a landscape by which change can occur. Now, this instant, the queer creature, says Parmenides, the instant lurks between motion and rest, being in no time at all. Then to it and from it, the moving thing's changes to resting, and the resting thing changes to moving. So it's obvious here that Parmenides is using maybe a slightly different definition of time. A bit bothersome that he doesn't bother to explain exactly what it is. But then again, I think we have to be a bit careful and remember that in the last paragraph we had come off of thinking about motion and rest occurring simultaneously. I'm not sure if he's gone back on that, and now we're just talking about the change between the state of motion and the state of rest. It kind of seems like we're doing that. Now the place that's the in-between, between the motion and rest, I would say that that's obviously in time. That would be the most thing that is in time by my grammar. That is, it is by the dimension of time that we can find some measure by which something has elapsed. And in that period of affordance, what we have is the exchange of information, so from one state to another. Now, if we are talking about the former, in which we're talking about a constant flipping between the two, motion, rest, then yes, we have a more difficult time of determining exactly if this is in time or not. In the absolute sense, if we say that it is not, then there's really no distinction between rest and motion. If we say that there is a distinction between rest and motion, I would have to imagine that there is a very small amount of time that elapses for that change to occur, if we are to keep the definition stable. But assuming that it happens outside of time, I'm not sure how to conceptualize it. But if we say the instant and wish to just speak on the instant for a moment, what we know is happening here is change. We're going from motion to rest or rest to motion. A state of excitability to a state of constancy, a state of immobility to a state of arousal, let's say. And to it and from it, the moving thing changes to resting, and the resting thing changes to moving. And the one, if in fact it both rests and moves, could change to each state. For only in this way could it do both. But in changes, it changes at an instant. And when it changes, it would be in no time at all. Well, an instant is an informal measure of time, so again, difficulty understanding here. And just when it would be neither in motion nor at rest. So let's move on a little bit farther down the road and see if there's something that we can draw from this. He continues and he says, "Is it so with the other changes too? Whenever the one changes from being to ceasing to be, or from not being to coming to be, isn't it then between certain states of motion and rest, and that it neither is nor is not, and neither comes to be nor ceases to be? It seems so, at any rate," says Aristotle. Indeed, according to the same argument, when it goes from one to many and from many to one, it is neither one nor many, and neither separates or combines. And when it goes from like to unlike, and from unlike to like, it is neither like nor unlike, nor is it being made like or unlike. And when it goes from large to small and equal and vice versa, it is neither small nor large nor equal. Nor would it be increasing or decreasing or being made equal. It seems not. The one, if it is, could undergo all that. Doubtless, says Aristotle. Now we've had these types of discussions before, in which we've asked the questions of a particular identity. When does it turn into something else or transform into something else? And when do we say that the identity has maintained itself over time, though much like as we age, we can say that we are the same person, the same being in a way. We are also different. We are different completely in the physical sense. Our cells are replaced. We are different psychologically and experientially. And balancing the state of constancy, or the state in general of the thing, and navigating the changes that occur when an identity undergoes some sort of informational transfer is difficult, I think, as I've said, to identify exactly when A becomes B or B becomes C. Now, I had this experience today. It happens to be a Sunday. Usually on Sunday evening, I go to a friend's house and we share a meal. And I found myself participating in this type of behavior, but I've observed that within the group, there can be a spirit that enters into the group that's not entirely defensive, but it's a few words come to mind. Defensive is one, emotional, uncontrolled emotions is another. Sort of a very strong stance without nuance on a particular subject. And these sorts of conversations usually devolve and they become quite combative, as one would imagine their nature is such that it affords that type of interaction. And again, stating that I engage in this behavior in my own mind, and at times when there are sensitive topics, I devolve into it. So I'm not saying that this is something that's just characteristic of my friend group, but nonetheless, I think there's a part of me that thinks that I might have engaged in this type of behavior. When I said that the instant was still in time, it was still a measure of time, I think I know what he's getting at, but I've failed to appreciate the meaning of the language that's used. And when he's saying instant, I don't think he is saying that it's a small duration of time. It's more like the edge or the threshold, the pivot or the boundary point of something. I think the main question is, why at this place can we call it a time-free zone, so to speak, in no time at all, as he says? And here I think it might be necessary to expand the mind a little bit and think about limit. In some sense, in terms of the value or in terms of purpose when examining limit or boundary of something, time in this instance would help us understand change and the mechanics of those changes, and perhaps even it would facilitate the thing that moves over the boundary. But it really doesn't tell us much about the boundary itself. The boundary participates in things that are greater than just time, in the sense that oneness and being have certain demands of them, particularly oneness. And it brings along with it implications of a boundary, of a center and an essence, a logos, if we will. And regardless of the dynamic process of how something changes, or rather, the fact that something does change, it again doesn't really describe what it means to reach the threshold in that instant. And in the instant, we have this strange mixture. The mixture is a determinate phrase, I think. Within the mixture, we don't have one state or the other. But we also don't really have a third state. And if we were to consider that way, I think it would only be a temporary consideration. Now, to go back to the main issue that I was having, how is it the case that this instant is something that rests outside of time? Our definition of time is taken on a rich sort of substrate to it, a dynamic substrate. I still maintain that there would be great difficulty in understanding a way in which the instant would be outside of time, and not necessarily thinking about the instant again as a small portion of time, but rather because I think it's still within the measurable domain. And I do also maintain that the purpose, the boundary point, is that transition point is something that we don't necessarily need time to reflect on. And we could say that Motion is a state. Rest is a state. And the instant is not really something that has duration, but it's like a 1 or a 0 type of situation. The boundary has either been crossed, the instant has been realized, or it is constantly either being approached or sped away from. Even if, in this case, when we say speed away from, we're moving from a place of motion to rest, because we're talking about the states in that relative sense. The instant is the passage between the durations, where the durations are specific to the states in question, the identity states in question, rest or motion. And so we can have the instant within time as a state transition within the field of time. Something that I suppose in a way can be measured, but it's not needed to be measured. Again, if we were to think about something, think about the point at which I reached adulthood, for example. How could we possibly identify the instant that could have happened? It's multifactorial. There are many things that build up that boundary, that threshold. There are many states that are consistent with adolescence, perhaps, that may have persisted after a certain age. And still, after a certain age, I maybe have been considered an adult. And there's cultural expectations and legal, civic underpinnings there as well. But it doesn't get lost within a new temporal state. It doesn't get lost in what we would call the sort of liminal transitory state, which can be a range of 5 years, let's say, from an adolescent moving into adulthood. Nor is it something that is a state of continuation, for which I could say of myself now, am I an adult or an adolescent? I wouldn't say, well, I'm an adolescent in particular ways and I'm an adult in particular ways. I would say that I'm an adult, but there may be some of these traits that are also similar to an adolescent. And so there are these absolute distinctions between things, even though there are shared relationships and shared characteristics. Okay, so today happens to be a new day. Like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'd like to move on from where we were. But keeping in mind the general reflection of yesterday about the instant, about the transformation of being from one thing to another, this identity shift, transformational shift. Parmenides says, must we not examine what would be proper for the others to undergo, if one is? We must. Are we to say, then, that properties, things other than the one must have, if one is? Let's do. Well then, since in fact they are other than the one, the others are not the one, for if they were, they would not be other than the one. That's right. And yet the others are not absolutely deprived of the one, but somehow partake of it. In what way, says Aristotle? and that things other than the one are surely other because they have parts. For if they didn't have parts, they would be altogether one. That's right. And parts, we say, are parts of that which is a whole. Yes, we do. Yet the whole, of which the parts are to be parts, must be one thing composed of many. Because each of the parts must be part, not of many, but of a whole. Why is that? If something were to be part of many, in which it itself is, it will, of course, be of both part of itself, which is impossible, and of each one of the others, if in fact it is part of all of them. For if it is not part of one, it will be part of the others, that one excepted, and thus it will not be a part of each one. And if it is not part of each, it will be a part of none of the many. But if something is part of none, it cannot be a part, or anything else at all, of those things of which it is no part of any. It certainly appears so, says Aristotle. So the part would not be part of many things, or all, but of some one character and of some one thing, which we call a whole, since it has come to be one complete thing composed of all. This is what the part would be part of. Absolutely. So if the others have parts, they would also partake of some one whole. Certainly. So things other than the one must be one complete whole with parts, necessarily. So let's go back through this slowly. The first small paragraph that I had read, starting with, must we not examine what would be proper for the others to undergo if one is? This is sort of a recurring exercise. So I'll restate some foundational information that we've gone through so far. So the one is composed of being and oneness. There are a few different components that I've been using to conceptualize up this identity. The bridge of coherence is one term that I have felt useful and I've kept throughout this series, and the bridge of coherence is meant to describe the special relationship and then the expression or the effect that is caused by the union between oneness and being. The union between oneness and being is not necessarily equivalent to a part of a whole, though it can be analogized in that way. Part of the reason that I've said that it cannot be seen as an equivalence, a true equivalence, that oneness and being are parts of the one, which in a way they are, is because the special unification between the two is such a principled affordance, or rather, their union offers such a principled affordance, such that all things can be on top of their expression. And this is quite a foundational principle or identity, and so we have to be very careful about thinking about how the mechanics of the parts interact with one another, because in some sense, in the case of the one, they are inseparable, because if they were to be separated, then all things would unravel. It doesn't mean reality would diminish, perhaps, but it would be impossible for all that we see before us to continue. And the distinction of the one as an independent identity compared to the others has been a topic, again, that has been recurring. It's useful in a way because we separate out the thing, the identity, the thing by which other things come to participate in, And we recognize that they are afforded by these underlying principles. And because we've separated out these principles, we have some grounding by which we can justify existing in reality. Now by this, because we have the identity of the one, we also have otherness, things that are identities that are other than the identity of the one. We also have the state or the expression of the one, let's say, and this is separated out into different layers. In the first layer, I'd say we have the one as the facilitated order, the ground. And this is something that is fundamental. This is where we find its expression. This is where we find the possibility for other things to navigate the software of that thing without disrupting it. In fact, participating in it and in a way being a part of it. And then we have sort of these graduated layers that are dependent upon grammar. In our predicate language, we have the one as it moves into articulation. So it's not just the one as a pure identity. It is the one as it is expressed in different degrees or angles, such that we can have a lamp or a cat or a table and have them all at the bottom have these foundational principles, and yet somewhere along the way the properties, the characteristics, the qualities are arranged differently, such that the expression is different. Are we to say then, says Parmenides, what properties things other than the one must have if one is? So, in my language, we've sort of formalized the definition of a property as something that is more surface level. It's the way it's the way in which something is expressed. Almost like I think of it as a physical instantiation of types. That when I think about my cat, I'm not thinking about general characteristics of the cat. I'm not thinking about general behavior traits. I'm thinking about how the cat appears to me now. My cat is black. My cat has 4 limbs. My cat has yellowish eyes. My cat weighs X amount. All of this, I think, would be within the property landscape. The deeper landscape is when we get into characteristics and properties, which I would say perhaps a character trait would be sort of an amalgam of different qualities. Now, earlier I said that my cat has 4 legs. I think this might breach a little bit deeper into the character or property territory, because it's specific to the kind. And now if I said my cat has 3 legs, it would still be possible to have this underlying stable component, the deeper structure of the identity. So I'm sort of hit or miss on that. The height of the cat, though, I think would be an example of a property. Now, if we were to define this, we would say that a property is an attributable feature of a thing. It is something that can be said of an identity at a given level or a given instance. A property does not necessarily tell us what kind of thing something is in its deeper structure. It may be variable while the identity remains what it is. So the property is the instance level or condition level feature that can vary without necessarily changing the thing's deeper kind. Now, a quality is a stable, structure-bearing feature that helps define what something is as the kind of thing it is. So it's deeper than a property. It's not just what can be said of it now, but what belongs to its formal or formed character in a more enduring way. So again, a quality is a stable character defining feature rooted in the organized structure of an identity. And in my ontology so far, the place that we put the quality is between the property at the top surface layer, and then in the deeper layer we have bare identity. And so it's somewhere in between there. It gives it sort of its descriptive features. So now we have character or characteristic. A character is the overall formed pattern or stable mode of being of a thing. It is broader than a single quality. It is more like the integrated profile of how an identity tends to be. So it would include multiple qualities and multiple properties. Now, a characteristic is a distinguishing mark or recurring feature by which something can be recognized. So this can span the vertical, as we've been mentioning. It can be deep or shallow depending on the context. But it usually, I think, means something that's notable and some identifying trait. So again, a characteristic is a recognizable feature or trait that helps identify something. Now, I think that there is, as with many things, a bit of dynamism. And I may be mistaken in certain respects about what is a property and what is a quality, but generally, when we see the vertical and we see the layers within the vertical, what we should recognize is that there is, when we approach deeper, before bare identity and before what I've formerly called the determinate landscape, we have this landscape of qualities. One of the big difficulties was moving from the determinate landscape to the landscape of qualities, and we had made some good headways. It's hard to point to one road exactly of how we got there, but in some sense, what we are trying to do now is just that: go through the exercise again. Except we are thinking about the one as it may stand, in a sense, before we have profound angular expression. It's not before differentiation. We've been through this before when we discussed the one as a potential pure unity, and we came to the conclusion that it is not. That difference permeates even the one itself, and articulation permeates the one itself. Now, Parmenides says, and yet the others are not absolutely deprived of the one, but somehow partake of it. And I think this is absolutely what we've been saying all along. The others is not something to be considered as something separate from the expression of the one. The others it implies a particular layer or level of observational abstraction, perhaps. Cognitive abstraction. And I say that because in language, when we speak about the one, we give all sort of defining terms to it. And all of this predicate language almost, I think, makes us lose the signal in the noise. I'm hoping that makes sense. The others is a broad category to refer to angular expression of the one. That all of the potential ways in which oneness in being can be expressed without destroying the foundation or the ground, which is the one, the identity of the one. But the identity of the one, again, is this identity that at least emerges grammatically because we have to differentiate it from otherness in order to make sense of the thing that facilitates otherness. Parmenides says, things other than the one are surely other because they have parts. For if they didn't have parts, they would be altogether one. Now, there's a way in which this is true, in the sense that there's a special relationship between oneness and being, foundationally so. And so we don't necessarily consider them to be parts, we consider them to be married. And in a marriage, two become one, the flesh becomes one. And in otherness, in the articulated order, there is the exposure of one identity to otherness, such that the possibility for it to transform into X identity into Y identity is possible. But the same interaction in the landscape of the one does not occur. The one would not transform into Y identity because of its approximation to it or its interaction with it. It's too foundational. For if they didn't have parts, says Parmenides, they would be altogether one. Now, this is an interesting conception. In my mind, I get caught in this sort of interlacing web or network of identities. And a series of identities may lead to a higher level order of something that may be part related. It has to be part related, that such that these parts, even parts that seem quite disordered and non-structured, come together in what is considered a whole. Even otherness as itself is a whole, a type of a whole. It has a broad part spectrum, so to speak, but that whole classification is used to encapsulate all of those things together. And of course, there are other things that other ways to classify and other ways to identify. Some more concrete, some more conceptual, but nonetheless, this pattern remains, in which there is the observational view of the parts, and each one of these parts has an individual identity of its own that can be analyzed, and eventually when we get to the bottom, when we get to the ground, what we have is the one. We have the expression, we have oneness in being. But then also we can think about it up from there in terms of parts that unify into something. And there are all these internal mechanics that each specific example that we may choose would undergo in terms of its consolidation and unification. And we can examine this from sort of a purposeful spiritual perspective, just as we can imagine this as a mechanical interplay of parts. And parts, says Parmenides, we say are parts of that which is whole, yet the whole of which the parts are to be parts must be one thing composed of many, because each of the parts must be part, not of many, but of a whole. If something were to be a part of many, in which it itself is, it will, of course, be both part of itself, which is impossible, and of each one of the others, if, in fact, it is part of all of them. Okay, so let's go into that last statement there. If something were to be part of many, in which itself is, it will, of course, be both part of itself, which is impossible. Okay, let's pause there. So we're thinking about the basic structure of an identity in which it has parts that composes it. Now we think about many. The many themselves are not necessarily, there are wholes in and of themselves. Internally, if we were to take an identity, we would imagine that until we reach the ground of the one, we would have just different parts for which, on the surface, some observing agent may not be able to see. So it says it will be both part of itself and each of the others. And so in this context, earlier I used a sort of a placeholder in the sense that the others, or we could just as easily substitute many. I've used this before in this dialogue, that this can be, in a sense, a type of identity. But I think if we are more specific, what we find is that where we are is moving from an identity landscape, which could be quite specific on the vertical, and then moving our way back to the determinate landscape, in which, when we say many, I think this is a determinate feature. And if we are to say that something quite specific is a part of this determinate feature, we are taking something that is descript and then saying that this descriptive part is to be subject to a nondescript whole, which is many. And so on one hand, it would be difficult to say that the many are intelligible, or it would be difficult to say that the many are as intelligible as its parts, which doesn't seem to make much sense. It would make sense that parts come together, they cohere such that they produce a stable and coherent unity that is perhaps as stable, as descriptive as the parts themselves. So today happens to be a new day, and like usual, a new day brings new thoughts. Now, I've been having some trouble centering my mind for the past hour or so, and so I like to sit here for a moment and just sort of be in the experience of the moment and slowly get into this dialogue. I got the feeling when listening to the last bit of recording that I was not as sharply attuned to where we were as I should have been, or where Parmenides is, I should say. That happens to be late April, and many of the trees have their leaves, the flowers have bloomed, the temperature is warming up. We've been in the upper 50s, lower 60s, mid 60s, and so it's been nice, a nice environment. We've had some rain, some flooding. And life seems to have gone on as usual, though needing, I think, a bit of a refurbishing. That is, my experience needs to draw that breath that mid-April, late April air can bring us, that freshness, the newness as everything comes out of winter into spring, into bloom, into life. It's one of the things that I appreciate about living in a climate where the seasons change, and they change fairly dramatically. Now, yesterday I don't think I quite grasped what Parmenides meant by the distinction in which he compared the whole of something and its parts, the parts participating in a unity, and the parts that participate in the many, which I think I may have introduced language that was a bit confusing to the true meaning of the text, in the sense that the many is an identity of sorts that has a boundary around it. It's meant to describe something, but it is very aspecific. And within that lack of specificity, I think we miss the broader point, especially when we're talking about something as specific as a unity or parts that participate in a whole. He says, yet the whole of which the parts are to be parts must be one thing composed of many, because each of the parts must be part, not of many, but of a whole. So we are to say that this whole is a type of unity that the parts come together to form. We are to say that many, although we can identify it as something, the parts are not cohering in the same way as they cohere in the whole, even if we are to call the many an identity. And it's the way in which the parts interact with each other, participate with each other, that's significant here. Now, I wonder if there's something that's more to be said, a little bit deeper. When we're considering, if we can't think about it in this way, something that is considered a part that participates in many versus something that's considered a part that participates in the whole, what we are seeing, as I've already said, is it's a type of participation that is leading towards something. There's a type of affinity that the parts have towards one another that necessarily make them at least agreeable enough to cohere into something unified. And that unified thing, at least from the observational standpoint, takes or can take precedence. That it can form the centerpiece of mind by which we reflect on or observe any particular experience, phenomena, or object. Now, I think it's within this interesting experience, this interesting participation, that we learn something of the qualities and of the characteristics or character traits of the identities in questions. These would be the identities of the parts. And I have to wonder at the principle that underlies this sort of agreeable principle, if we can call it that. We could view it rather sharply and say that it's just a mechanical fitting, like a key in a lock. We can view it spiritually, perhaps, and we could say that maybe there's, within this agreeable principle, there's something that approximates an alignment, some sort of alignment that produces a harmony, and a harmony is something that reverberates. Now, there are plenty of things that unify towards destructive ends, but nonetheless, like many things in life and like many things throughout our history, there's often good with the bad. They're almost inseparable. Not to say perhaps that they are wed together, but rather the processes that unfold, that allow these to take place from unification to disintegration, are so multi-layered and multivariate that we are bound to come across, even in the worst of things, in the worst of unities, we are bound to find some sort of harmony among the parts that lead to that unification. I'm not sure why I'm focusing so harshly on this, or acutely on this, but I think it perhaps can be a potential sticking point that I have to resolve in my mind. But this underlying principle, this harmony, I have to say that there's something probably of love that's within it. There's a purposeful element for which guides information into unity. The extent to which this principle might participate in things outside of my experience, it's hard for me to say. And perhaps I'm just desiring this to be the case, but at the very least we can say that there are things, that there are identifiable characteristics, and perhaps qualities of things that allow them to associate with other things, even if on the surface they seem incompatible. Now, again, Parmenides, he says, "Yet the whole of which the parts are to be parts must be one thing composed of many, because each of the parts must be part, not of many, but of a whole." Why is that? If something were to be part of many, in which it itself is, it will, of course, be both part of itself, which is impossible, and of each one of the others, if in fact it is part of all of them. So again, we go back to this semi-confusing state in which we have something that's identifiable. We have the many that's before us. The mind itself, as a productive exercise, the mind, the observer, cannot focus the attention, cannot find the signal through the noise. And so we have all of these different things. But despite having all of these different things, we're looking in a particular direction. We're looking in a particular surface area, let's say. And within that field of view, within the observational landscape, this is our many. And so all of these identities can be considered now parts of that diffuse whole, let's say. But we have to be careful not to get confused there. Now the thing is, the difference between the one or the true whole or the true unification and the sort of pseudo-unification of the many is that the parts sort of self-sacrifice their prominence, let's say, into some higher order purpose. And this self-sacrificial participation allows a true unity to form. If we have this pseudo-whole, then the parts retain such of their identity that they do not participate with each other. And by their lack of participation, we understand the type of unity that it forms, a very loose, chaotic, inattentive, unorganized, non-purposeful, non-directed expression of the one. So we have an interesting parallel, not just to the Christian message and the example of Christ, but also the dangers of something seemingly so simple as this sort of this obscure identity that we really haven't formalized. We haven't instantiated, but yet we can rationalize through the problem how exactly it would come to a situation in which its selfish disposition and lack of participation would lead to it being what Parmenides is calling a part of itself. And this is something that's inconsistent with reality. Now, this is something that we have to explore. And I think that this is, getting this is not something that is easy, but it is necessary. It seems like it should be straightforward, but it's not. So I think that there's the implication that all things participate in something above themselves. There's an inherent vertical in this identity landscape. And I've always had trouble, I think, in the Old Testament and in philosophy, in terms of defining the vertical and the horizontal. Sometimes they change, not like they flip, but I think contextually they change. And sometimes through the context I lose the broader significance of the vertical. But it's becoming more clear here in the sense that as we move up, what we are seeing is the level of participation. We're going through the layers of unity. And at each higher perspective, what we have is a different way of participating with other identities. All the while, all along this vertical, we have this dynamic transformational process in which things are changing. Structures are being destroyed, I suppose, or destructed, and others are being constructed. Some are stable, some are unstable. All of them yet connected, perhaps loosely as though they may be. And I'm reminded of a day or two ago when we were speaking about a different type of vertical in which we were moving from the ground up to something that is determinate, but within the determinate level, we have something that is nondescript. Then we get into kind, qualities, characteristics, in which we have now descriptive language. And it's this progression of the articulate order, and then again up through properties and particular instantiation, states of instantiation, that we have kind of a vertical resolution type effect. And I think that this is also consistent with what we're speaking about here in terms of levels and layers of participation. Is it something that we can exactly boil down to the number of these parts integrating into wholes that are then parts that integrate into wholes that are then parts that integrate into wholes? Is it a matter of sophistication of this undulating process, or is it purely within the participation? I think there's something to be said of the undulating process, that we can have quite sophisticated structures that emerge out of this undulating part unifying into whole, and then the whole being another part of some other unified thing. We are that way. But I also imagine that it doesn't have to have all of these levels to participate at a particular level. Its participation itself may be a sufficient ticket to get into the sort of exclusive club along the vertical. Now, there's another part of what Parmenides says here that we have to consider. He says that if something were to be part of many, in which it itself is, it will, of course, be both part of itself, which is impossible, and of each one of the others, if in fact it is part of all of them. Now, it's a bit loose here. On one hand, I think that it makes sense because on the part of the many, if the many is to be something considered as our loose pseudo-identity, then the parts of this pseudo-identity must participate with that in a particular way to maintain their ontological level, let's say. And by their loose participation, they're rather low in the vertical. And their participation with each other is selfish. And by their shared selfishness, we can say, I think, that there is a degree of these identities that permeates throughout all of them. There's a behavior trait that's similar throughout all of them. I'm not sure I can draw anything conclusive in the sense that the part of that is the many, a part of the many, is sort of identical to other parts. I don't think that's what Parmenides is saying here, nor do I think it makes sense. But there is an equivalence in relation to its behavior and participation, and this is where the significance rests, I think. Parmenides says, "For if it is not part of one, it will be part of the others. That one accepted, and thus it will not be part of each one." So let's take this one step at a time. For if it is not part of one, now in this I'm assuming that he's saying it if it's not part of a whole, let's say, outside of otherness. So again, if it is not part of one, it will be part of the others. And I think what he means here is that it is participating again in that selfish unity of sort of self-independence and lack of participation with others, lack of formal sort of hierarchical integration, the resistance to that. For if it is not part of one, it will be part of the others, that one accepted. Now here I have to think of the others as being a form of oneness, and thus it will not be part of each one. So there's sort of a telescoping view, I think, that's happening here that can be a little confusing. For if it is not part of one, he's talking about a type of unity, and the particular vertical matters here. Now this is the vertical that is away from the distributed unity. This is higher in the vertical. For if it is not part of one, it will be part of the others, but still there's oneness in the others. And we consider, well, where is the oneness? Well, it could be just otherness itself, or it could be within the particulars, the parts of those others, or itself. Now that one accepted here meaning excluded, that one excluded. So if we are to say that that one is excluded, then of course the way in which it would participate with otherness is not considered here. And if it is not part of each, it will be part of none of the many. I think that this is consistent. And now I have to remind myself that we are low down in the vertical. And so in this language, we are not giving the many or otherness very much weight in terms of its unifying potential or capacity. And so we're giving it a type of denial, I think, to run through the exercise to see how it plays out, what it means at this level. So we would have to then consider, if it is not part of otherness or part of many, what is it a part of? And not moving into the selfish disposition, because we again mentioned that there's an impossibility there, that a self-sustaining or existing identity is impossible. It requires the flow of information. But if something is part of none, now this is an interesting turn, because now we're using the word none, which is also an identity. It's a contextual identity. None, or absence, is really only something that is seen within the relationship of things that are. Now, nothingness or no thing is often an intermediary. It's a transitory, liminal type of state. But if it's a part of none, we could say that it is a part of difference. But we can also say that because if it is to be a part of difference, we say that it participates in difference. That difference is something that cuts. It's something that separates. It's not something that's conducive to parts. It cannot be a part, says Parmenides, or anything else at all, of all those things of which it is no part of any. So the part would not be part of many things or all, but of some one character and of some one thing, which we call a whole. Since it has one character and of some one thing, which we call a whole, since it has come to be one complete thing composed of all, that is what the part would be of. So if the others have parts, they would also partake of some one whole. So things other than the one must be one complete whole with parts. So I think if something can be said here as we close off this episode, is that we are approaching more intimately this idea of the interlacing, interwoven, layered aspects of reality, such that things that are must exchange, things that are must relate and participate if they are to be maintained. And because they participate, they participate in unity, they themselves as identities, and then also into the layers above them. And of course below them they're involved in as well. The other thing I think that's notable is when Parmenides says, so the part would not be part of many things or all, but of some one character and of some one thing, which we call a whole, since it has come to be one complete thing composed of all. What I think of here is that center point, which, from my perspective, of course, or from the human perspective, the subject is the point of attention. It's the logos. This is the whole, this is the unification, this is the bringing together of separation into unification. And there's some one character about the thing that undergoes that process. There's that degree, that expressional degree that comes off of the affordance of the one, of oneness in being. So this is where I'm going to end this episode, and we're going to continue next time with part 21 of Parmenides.